Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Thanks everybody for tuning in. As you're all aware, and we've talked to our guest today and let him know, Dr. Craig Harper is with us and is one of the principal investigators on the Big Tennessee project that's ongoing. And we're talking in particular about this idea that we may want to consider moving the season dates later in our harvest frameworks. And there's a lot of really interesting work being done, and some of that work is some that you're engaged in Tennessee, Craig. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us about this. I know this is a really popular issue, and people are really concerned about it, and I think it's with good reason. And thank you for taking time to come tell us about what you've been doing and how it relates to that issue.
No problem. Always glad and fun to talk to both of you. Looks like y'all found a comfortable place in the library there to set up for the podcast. Are you sure you're not causing too much racket in the library there?
They've shushed us a few times, but oh well.
Yeah, they actually put quiet signs facing out around us so that everybody else stays quiet.
Is that grizzly above you from the Auburn area, or where'd that come from, Will?
North Alabama.
Yeah. Right on the Tennessee border.
You shot it beside a Black Panther, I bet.
I did. I actually got both of them. The Black Panther rug is at home, but Neva wouldn't let me put the bear rug in there, so it didn't match the decor.
Well, it looks like y'all are having too much fun here with your podcast, so that's good.
Yeah, we've certainly been having a lot of fun. No question. Well,
yeah. So Craig, everybody. I guess I shouldn't say everybody, but most people I think have heard you talk before, especially on a variety of habitat management issues. Whether it be for wild turkeys or white-tailed deer, northern bobwhite. But you're also involved in this, like Marcus just mentioned, this big TWRA study that involves some season date manipulation and measuring turkey productivity responses. Would you tell us a little bit about kind of the origin of that study and the thought process in designing it?
Yeah, well, in around 2015, 2016, there had been a lot of concern about the turkey harvest declining, especially in South Middle Tennessee and what is in Tennessee in the southern portion of Region 2. And so TWRA approached me and Dave Bueller and asked us about conducting a study to look at the reasons why the turkey harvest was declining and perceived population decline in the area. You can't immediately assume that the population is in decline when the harvest declines, but that's, intuitive. And so we began the study in 2017, and it's still going on now. And we've had some changes along the way in terms of direction with regard to what we're specifically looking at. But the whole time we've looked at productivity of the birds, the nest, the brood survival, of course, habitat use, adult survival. And we followed over, I think, 400 hens. We try to have at least 100 hens on air each year. And so we have nearly 700 hen days, if you include the hens that have remained on air over multiple years or that we have recaptured. And so we've gotten a lot of information through the course of the study. And in the last 2 years, with the consideration and concern over season setting dates, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency Commission, they voted to delay the opening of the Tennessee turkey season by 2 weeks in 2021, in the spring of 2021, in 3 of the counties that we're working in. So we're working in 5 counties. In 3 of the counties, there had been a decline in harvest. In adjacent 2 counties, there had not been a decline in harvest. And so they implemented a 2-week delay in the season opener in those 3 counties in which there had been a decline. And so now we've been able to collect data for 2 years with regard to hens nesting, the timing of nest initiation, hatchability, poults per nest, et cetera, in those counties that experienced the 2-week decline versus the other 2 counties that had not had a reduction in harvest, and there was no delay in the season opening in those counties. And so now for the past 2 years, we've had an experiment where we've been able to look at any effect delaying the season opener by 2 weeks may have in those counties.
Yeah, that's a powerful design. I don't know, Marcus, if you want to get right into those results, but one of the things that stood out to me that Craig was saying is that they've been collecting this data for 6 years, and I mean that's really commendable. You don't have many turkey research projects where the funding agency is even interested for funding it for that long, much less also having PIs that are interested in conducting the work for that length of time.
And the sample sizes on top of the manipulative studies design so rare. Right. Having both over long term.
I'm looking at the numbers now. As of this year, we've tracked 446 hens, 642 hen years, if you will, and right at 600 nests monitored. And let me also say the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency certainly is to be commended for not only funding the project, but also they have put a lot of skin in the game with helping with trapping and securing sites. In each of those 5 counties, we have 2 sites. So we have 10 sites in which we're looking at all this. And the folks with TWRA have helped immensely, both the field personnel as well as the administrative folks. And I'm not saying that to try and get more money out of them here on the podcast.
I was going to say that sounds like way more work than even the most devoted graduate student would be capable of handling by themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
And we've had 2 master's students and a PhD student on the project, and the second master's student and the PhD student they'll be finishing up next year.
Okay. So I think we really want to get into the results related to season dates, but before we go there, Craig, can you share any key takeaways that you think have resulted from having such an extended data set? I mean, particularly related to ups and downs in reproduction and reproductive success, because, Marcus and I, and I'm sure you do too, talk to people all the time that talk about up and down hatch years and the places that they hunt and the places that they frequent. Is that something that you guys got a good feel for over that period of time?
Yeah, of course, the nest success has fluctuated. Poult survival, of course, has fluctuated. You have good years and you have poor years, but in general, we're in the mid 20s with regard to nest success, 26 to 8%, somewhere in that neighborhood. And poult survival also somewhere around 20% overall. Some years are poor and some years, might bump at or above 30%. So yeah, it's you have to look at things like this over as long of a period as you can because of that annual variability.
Mm-hmm. So you're seeing 10% swings, up to 10% swings in poult survival, like 20 to 30% from one year to the next,
or even greater. I remember one year that overall poult survival was at or just below 10%.
Okay.
So you can see huge swings in either of those over the course of time.
And what about nest success? What is the range in that parameter that you've seen?
Around 20 to 40%, something like that. But overall average is in the mid-20s.
Okay. But in some years it's doubled.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that's just further emphasizes the importance of monitoring turkey populations across longer time spans.
Yeah, and I think Craig, what you said is a take-home message that people need to, internalize, is that the variation on the same site, even when, from year to year, when nothing changed, is still it's highly variable. And you have to put that in context when you're thinking about some of these studies. You need to do it over a longer term and have it well replicated and designed to account for the fact that things just vary a lot from year to year anyway. So it's, if it's a shorter term study and less well replicated, some treatment effects may not actually be treatment effects if you're not fully capturing that.
And I might add, we also observed considerable year to year variability in hatchability, which of course is the percentage of eggs that hatch. And it was actually more than I would have expected when we looked at hatchability among the study sites and only using those years with adequate sample sizes of successful initial nest and not including re-nests, which we all know can be relatively low compared to the initial nest. We observed hatchability range from 73% to 97% year to year, and that was both in the delayed and non-delayed counties, and both before and after the delay.
And when you say the percentage of eggs that hatch, you mean the percentage of eggs that obviously that make it through the entire incubation period that hatch, right?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that.
Well, that's really interesting.
Because I know the average has been reported to be around 75% is the number that I've heard multiple times. And it's just 1 year of data. And we know that from what we just talked about, there's a lot of annual variability in that rate. But granted, last year in Alabama, that's what we saw, was about 75%.
And so if we look at all counties, all sites, all years, the hatchability average is 87%.
Okay.
Yeah. And thinking about your study design and why, at least one of the major thrusts of the study is to look at that season framework. What's your feeling on how the season change has affected the different parameters that you're monitoring?
Right now, as of 2022, this past year, after 2 years of the delay, we haven't seen any. The incubation initiation dates remain extremely consistent, and I'm talking about like within 3 days. So the median incubation initiation date from 2017 to 2022 is from April the 25th to April the 30th. So 5 days. So it goes, 25, 26, 25, 27, 25, 30. So it's very consistent with regard to nest initiation. And that's true in all the counties. In the non-delayed counties in the past 2 years, the median incubation initiation date was April 27th and May the 2nd. In the delayed counties, it was April 24th and April the 30th. So it's all just right there within a couple of days.
That's tight.
And there's as much variation or more between years as it is between delayed or non-delayed counties.
Yeah. So you mentioned that on the delayed counties, they moved the season date back 2 weeks. So what became the new start date following the delay?
Well, and this is interesting. In Tennessee, from what I can gather from TWRA, the Tennessee turkey season has opened on the Saturday closest to April the 1st since 1986 or 87. And the annual bag limit has been 4 birds until a couple of years ago, and that was reduced in some of the experimental counties, as well as some counties in West Tennessee that had experienced a lot of flooding. And so our season open date has been consistent for 40 plus years. So the actual date, it changes because it's the first Saturday closest to April the 1st, but it's 2 weeks later. So on average, you're looking at around April the 14th or 15th, something like that.
Okay. Well, that change pretty closely aligns with the recommendation made in the ISBEL paper that came out of the Southeast Wild Turkey Working Group, I believe, right? That suggested that, if season timing and, intensive early harvest of males in spring is interfering with reproduction, that ideally you would delay the season opening till the median incubation date. But that probably wasn't palatable to hunters, right? So they said that the next best thing would be to initiate it when hens start laying. And that should be, if you're having average incubation date towards the end of April, you back up 2 weeks, and that's about where you guys are at.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, the median incubation date is going to be in that 4th week of April, April 25, April 26, 25, 27, 25, 30. So there's the median dates for the past 6 years. And so if you didn't open turkey season in Tennessee until April the 25th, there's going to be some unhappy folks.
Right. That's what the working group was saying. And they were saying, so the best next option would be to move it back at least until most hens started laying. They initiated laying, which is when y'all would be at now, right? With 2 weeks before.
See, what is interesting to me is what happened to the turkey population from 1986 or 87 all the way until 2015, 16, when the population began to level off. And so it increased like this. It went up dramatically with no change in the season opening date or the annual bag limit. Yeah, and so in the face of the season opening at that time, Tennessee experienced a tremendous increase in the turkey population, and obviously in the turkey harvest.
Yeah.
So obviously opening the season at that time did not prevent the population from increasing to tremendous levels all across the state.
You have shown several graphs and things showing these different data, and we're planning to make those available online for people, so you can actually see the data visually on these graphs that you've walked through. I think that's a really important point, and that you did see that this steep incline, so an increasing population of the turkeys in Tennessee during that time of the initial framework. And I also want just to make sure that I heard you correctly and to reiterate, that you don't see any, at least initial, even these first couple of years after the change to 2 weeks later, you have not seen a corresponding change in when hens initiated their nests. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's true. We have not seen anything yet.
Okay.
And I just shared my screen so you can see the statewide spring turkey harvest by region in Tennessee. And if I go back a couple of slides and I can send this to you, this is simply the statewide harvest data. You can see that trend, how it has gone over time from 1990 till at least to 2021. And Tennessee harvested a all-time record number of birds in 2020. And so, you could make equal argument that we should increase the bag limit or hunter availability to a broader range of dates, as opposed to decrease it when you're killing a record number of birds. And even last year, it wasn't a record season, but it was still in amongst some of the top years ever with regard to turkey harvest in Tennessee. So overall, Tennessee turkey hunters should be very happy. I think we have obviously reached a plateau of where the turkey population is going to go. And I just had one of the graduate students do this recently, is put the human population in Tennessee on the same graph as the turkey harvest data. And the human population, it's still doing this. It's not plateauing off. And so when you think of how much habitat there was available to turkeys through the 80s, 90s, and into 2000, 10 or 11, when we were reaching those initial peaks, think of how much less habitat there is statewide now from what there was in 2010 or 11, with all of the increase in human population and the associated infrastructure of buildings and roads and everything else. You can't go back and have equal numbers of birds of an all-time level when the birds have less area to inhabit. And so I think that has to be taken into account, particularly in some states that have experienced such huge human population increases.
Yeah, that's a good point. Craig, I can't see the numbers from where I'm sitting. That red line that you have perpendicular to the blue.
That's simply an arbitrary line showing what we call the restoration phase. Previous to that, when of course birds were still being captured and located in other places where they were trying to build the population, and then into the quote maintenance phase.
Okay. Yeah, and it's interesting, Marcus. You need to get your eyes checked because I can see that just fine, but
I can see the stuff, but I can't read the numbers on it. And I did get my eyes checked yesterday, and I'm still having some adverse issues about that. So,
but what's interesting to me about it, though, is he's got that line drawn at 2005, and that's the exact year that so many of these states, including Alabama, which I'm most obviously familiar with, saw either peak harvest or the beginnings of declines. Mm-hmm. And that's stays relatively consistent, plus or minus a few years across most of our southeastern states.
Yeah.
But seeing this figure, it looks to me like almost a classic case study of a population that goes through exponential growth and then reaches some carrying capacity and fluctuates around that point.
That's what I was about to say. Is it looks a lot like what we teach a carrying capacity curve to look like. Which we're also going to
you look at some states, and not I haven't analyzed data from all these other states, but especially states such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina, they're still on the increase. But if you look, that increase is beginning to lessen. And so I would predict that it's not going to be long at all before those states start seeing this plateau effect also, where they're simply holding as many birds as they're going to.
Do you think, the initial thought that goes through my mind when you said that is that, is it possible? I don't know anything about the restocking history of those states compared to Tennessee, Alabama, or Georgia, but was it a more recent occurrence so that those populations would still be in this exponential growth phase?
Tennessee has worked to restock birds for many years. I don't know that Alabama, for example, did that prior to Tennessee, but perhaps the number of birds was greater, but certainly the turkey population in Alabama established much sooner than Tennessee's did. And same thing for Kentucky, North Carolina, for example. They didn't see those increases in harvest until much later years. And I think that is really a result of the restocking efforts, at least whether it be when they were doing it or the numbers of birds that were being relocated. I think the relocation in those states was going on much later than in Alabama, for example, because they already had well-established populations in most areas of the state.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, Craig, I think everybody probably listening to this knows that your expertise is really centered in habitat stuff, or at least that's what I've always viewed you as being that expert. I know you've done turkey-centric work as long as I've known you. I think all the way back to your graduate studies focused on turkeys, and I know that you were a passionate hunter of turkeys and take advantage of opportunity whenever you get the chance.
Nobody sets my calendar but me, Marcus. So as long as you continue to allow all these other people set your calendar, you're not going to get to turkey hunt that much.
Yeah. Well, I've been taking notes watching you over the years. I'm definitely taking that to heart, that I need to make sure that I, take advantage of opportunity at any time that I can. But the reason I wanted to preface with that is one of the things I think that has emerged as a concern, that's definitely relevant to the hunting season framework discussion, is this idea that we might see hens nest later, and there's some work that has shown that late nesting hens tend to be less productive and successful than early nesting hens. And regardless of that part of the argument, from your perspective, as a habitat expert, could you walk us through, I guess, what a poult would face if it was born, let's say, quote, during the normal time, versus if you delayed that 3 weeks or a month, in terms of the habitat change and what the poult is having to overcome to survive through that? Are there any things that are changing to be negative for the poult?
With plant communities or insect communities,
like plant productivity or the structure or insect production, those sorts of things?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, we do extensive vegetation work in all these studies, and a lot of vegetation work in studies, for example, that are looking at the effects of fire or the effects of silviculture when there are not turkeys transmitted. It's not a turkey project per se, but looking at the vegetation response to different management practices. If you're looking at the vegetation condition in the woods or woodlands where you have less than 50% sunlight coming into the stand, in closed canopy conditions, you're going to have, typically 3 to 5% sunlight coming into the stand. And you don't get that much of an understory response until you allow a minimum of 20% into the stand. And of course, a little better at 30%. But at that level of sunlight, the change in vegetation density or height in the understory is going to be negligible from, for example, late May, early June to late June, early July, something like that. So, we've done, all kinds of measurements through the summer looking at that type of thing, and you're not going to see that much change. Now, in more open conditions where you have at least 50% sunlight coming in, or of course, in early successional areas where you may have up to 100% sunlight into old fields and that kind of vegetation community, then you can certainly see more of a change with regard to the height of the vegetation, not so much change with regard to the density of the vegetation, because, for example, if there's a lot of grass growth, that density at ground level presented by the grass is going to be just as dense in late May, early June as it would be in late June, early July. And with the forbs, you're going to have X number of plants that have germinated and are growing. And by late May, they already are, it could be anywhere from, according to which plants, 1 to 2 feet tall, something like that. But the density of them is going to be consistent from then until early July. You're not going to see necessarily an increase in the density of plants, but certainly you will see an increase in the height of the vegetation. So the height of the vegetation certainly may influence the hens. More typically, they like to be in areas where they have better visibility, and so when you have a whole lot of vegetation that's blocking visibility and such that the hen can't see, it's that dense and thick, you typically won't see that much use. And that's certainly what we have seen in this turkey study. The majority of brood locations, when they are in or around early successional communities, or along the periphery or the edges of those openings, if the vegetation is so dense that it's causing problems with the poults getting into those openings. And you'll see them use the forest and woodlands more, the adjacent forest and woodlands more in those situations. We do see more use of the fields when the structure of the vegetation at ground level is such that mobility of the poults is good, and they can get through the area, and hens have good visibility. And so that's where your management comes in. And so I would say that the usability of early successional areas certainly could be different from late May to early July, but the understory vegetation in forest and woodlands with certainly less than 30 or 40% vegetation, you're not going to see that much of a difference in those. That might have been a long way around to answer the question, but hopefully I
so basically no.
No, that's good stuff. And I mean, and I think in a lot of areas we're more reliant on vegetation and woodlands to provide brooding habitat for turkeys, just because true early successional areas are so limited across the landscape.
Well, Craig, you measured the availability of early succession, right, in the study, in the counties. What percentage of the landscape was in that early succession? Do you remember?
I can look right quick.
I remember. I know what you're talking about. It was a staggering statistic that I felt like he shared with me before about the rate of selection for early succession versus availability across the landscape.
If I recall,
I got numbers in mind, but I'll look so I'm not giving you something wrong. The amount of early succession is like old field areas, about 3%, and shrubland 4.5%. And so most of these counties, 38% deciduous forest, about 8% pine or cedar, but pasture hay 34%, row crop 5%. So it's a lot of open ground, but most of it is working lands in hay or pasture and some row crop. But the percentage of nests in either early succession or shrubland is 45%. When that's
7% of the landscape, roughly, right, together.
Excuse me?
That was 7% together of the landscape.
That's right.
But at
45% of the nests are concentrated where that type of cover is available.
Mm-hmm.
So turkeys like that.
I would venture so far to say so. Yeah.
One may conclude. Well, that was just like Marcus. I was sharing that study with you, that in their modeling exercise, they found that the top model that was predicting, I think it was occupancy by gobblers, was availability of early succession, and it only represented about 7% of the landscape.
Yeah. I remember it was, when you told me the number, I was thinking, man, I think that was the same thing from the Tennessee study.
Yeah.
The same percentage of the landscape.
Right. So,
our nest success was relatively high in those communities as well. At about 36%. That's those nests in early succession experienced the greatest success of others. The nest success in woods, for example, where pine or deciduous, around 30%, and in shrubland 26%, and all of the other vegetation types less than 20%. So that type of cover obviously is important for nesting, but it's not necessarily good for brooding, because many of those early successional areas are so dense, especially with grass, that poults literally can't navigate through that. And so we're seeing all the time that these broods are using around the edges of those openings and in the woods.
So is that, just to be clear to the audience, that when you're saying grass, is that primarily like fescue and those types of grasses, or is it even native grass?
Most of the fields, of course, do have non-native grasses, and the number one non-native grass in this area would be, or the most prevalent one would be tall fescue. We also have Bermuda grass. We have a fair amount of orchard grass, other non-native grasses, of course, Johnson grass and Dallas grass. But look, even if it's native grass, whether it's broom sedge or big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, switchgrass, whatever, grass is grass if you've got too much of it. If it's just so dense and cluttering up the space at ground level, it's not good. And so concentrating more on forbs is hugely important, not only for the mobility, but there are many more insects and other invertebrates associated with forbs than with grasses. Mm-hmm. Grasses are so high in lignin content that you don't see nearly as many invertebrates in grass-dominated communities as you do in forb-dominated communities. Mm-hmm. But even with that, the height of some forb communities may be too high, and the density of some forb communities may be too dense to allow good mobility, germination from the seed bank. And according to how it's been managed, you still might have, a lot of litter where, a lot of the seed is less available than if the open space was greater at ground level, So the management of these sites is critical. And another interesting thing that I got Lindsay Phillips, she's a PhD student to calculate, is what percentage of these nests were being destroyed by mowing, because mowing for most landowners is the practice that they use to,
well, that's how you manage fields, right?
To keep fields open instead of letting them grow up in whatever. And so 12% of the nests that occur in either early succession, food plots, hay fields, pastures, row crop, 12% are destroyed by mowing alone. That's huge. If you could increase your nest success potentially by at least 10%, simply by not getting on the tractor and mowing fields during the nesting season, that's a big deal.
Well, I don't even logically see why that would occur. I mean, if you don't mow during nesting, or you mow during nesting, that's a problem. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? Don't mow the places that they like the most. You got 7% of your landscape in this, and then you mow it during nesting when the hens have selected that disproportionately. Yeah, you've mowed down the best place to have the nest, and did it while all the nests were in it. You
directly destroyed the nest on top of that. And it's funny to me how many people are willing to give mowing a pass, but then they're so critical of burning during nesting season. We
can't even burn one nest up,
right?
Or it goes.
Which I'm not saying we shouldn't be cognizant of timing of burning in that regard, but it's just that mowing doesn't get that same reputation, and furthermore, I think mowing, not only potentially negatively destroys nests, but you're increasing grass density and increasing the thatch layer with mowing at the same time. Yeah. Which is negatively affecting habitat quality on down the road as well.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
and it's not just landowners. Even state agencies. They still are, not all of them, but many of them, and in many places within certain state agencies, they're still mowing openings as a way of keeping those openings open. Mm-hmm. And hey, I've been there. I used to be a professional mower. That really was my job with a state agency as a wildlife technician. From May through September, that's all I did. I got on the tractor and I mowed. I mowed and mowed and mowed. I mowed up fawns. I've mowed up turkey nest. I've mowed up rabbits and songbirds. I'm riding around on the tractor with a wildlife patch on my arm. What am I doing? I remember one time I just stopped the tractor and I thought, what am I doing? Because of a reduction in the fall recruitment of many of these animals. And of course, I started asking questions, and they didn't like that. But
I didn't expect a confessional today.
You need to start asking some questions. This is bad management. Let's just call it what it is.
Yeah. Why do I not have any turkeys, but I have all these feathers everywhere? Strewn about the mowed
if you've got
fields.
to mow, if you can't burn, if you can't disc, et cetera, at least try to hold off your mowing until mid to late winter. That cover also is needed for many species during the wintertime.
Yeah.
But if you can hold off your mowing until that time of year, which makes mowing actually so much easier because you don't have all of the biomass on top of the ground, as you do during the middle of the growing season. Just holding your mowing off until that time of year can make a huge effect with regard to the cover that is available during the reproductive season.
Yeah.
But even better, you would start using fire to set back those areas instead of mowing in most cases, right?
Yes, we just finished a study. Bonner Powell was the master student comparing deer forage, bobwhite foods, openness at ground level, species richness of plants, et cetera, in early successional areas that were mowed versus fire, side by side. And that paper is about to come out in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. But dramatic differences with regard to forage availability for deer, structure for nesting or brooding for turkeys, food availability for bobwhite. So yeah, I mean, and that's not Shazam, a real revelation, but it is good to have a lot of replicated sites with sound data showing, okay, folks, here's the difference that mowing versus fire provides. And fire in general is better.
But if you can't burn,
all that being said, it's not that you shouldn't ever mow. There's reasons for mowing in some places at some times. For example, and I know we can't go into all of that, but even if you're burning all the time, when, how often, what time of year you burn, it can strongly influence the plant composition. And so you can ultimately go to just, a field full of native grass, or you can go to a field full of nothing but goldenrod, or a field full of nothing but blackberry. And so knowing how your management affects the plant composition is huge. And so no one thing is going to solve all that. The best management is going to involve, fire, disking, herbicides, perhaps mowing at some point in time, et cetera.
Well, I think one of the take-home messages, and you kind of keyed in on it with fire, which for some reason this time I didn't key in on that particular thing. I keyed in on a different aspect, but this is something that's pretty simple to gain 10 or more % back. I mean, especially there's some landowners out there that are doing their more than their share of mowing during that time, but you were talking about people really key in on not losing a nest to fire, but the other thing is a lot of folks are trying to address the predation problem with trapping and would be tickled to gain 10% out of trapping on nest success. But here's a practice that you could pretty easily just don't crank the tractor up and go mow everything down during that time and potentially gain that same thing. And it's, that's something that we could all do really easily and potentially make a big impact.
Sure. And I would strongly recommend both. I mean, you can easily pick up additional nest success by not mowing during the nesting season. But also, look, the big limiting factor that we have easily identified is predators, both on the nest and the poults. I mean, my gosh, that's why we push so hard to allow trapping of coons at least in the months prior to nesting season, and TWRA changed the regulations to allow that year round. Is that going to reduce the statewide coon population? No, but on properties where somebody is interested in turkeys and managing specifically for turkeys, you better believe that you can have an impact on turkey nest success if you go in and trap those mammalian nest predators in the months preceding the nesting season. I mean, working with so many properties, we have seen tremendous increases in turkey numbers once some trapping began to take place.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because I know that we've heard that from lots of landowners. And as you know, we've gone through trying to characterize the literature on it. And at least for turkeys, the data on it's pretty weak. And we were really surprised about that. But you still hear from a lot of landowners that they perceive a really high degree of success from trapping. So I'm glad you brought that in.
On average of the nests that are preyed upon, about 60% of those are from mammals, and around 10 to 15% is avian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that I want to go back to too is we were talking about mowing and the potential effects on nest success by, just obviously mowing over a nest. You have direct destruction, but let's even assume that, of course, you've got nests that are outside of that area that was mowed that end up being successful. Well, depending on when that mowing occurs and where you're at, whether all that kind of stuff, you may have also taken away some quality brood rearing cover too. Mm-hmm. So not only would you potentially destroy the nests that are directly in that area, but then by mowing, you've taken away cover that poults on down the road would have used, especially if early succession is limiting like it is in most places. You've taken away that cover type as well.
That's true. That's true also with fire in the woods. Mm-hmm. We have done so much work with fire and looking at the vegetation response. When you burn in late April and early May, it takes that vegetation a long time to respond and get tall enough to provide decent brood cover. Mm-hmm. And all of the work that we've done looking at the timing of fire, and especially on vegetation response, whether it's herbaceous or woody, there is virtually no difference with regard to woody resprouting if you burn during the early portion of the growing season versus if you burn in the dormant season. Mm-hmm. And you may or may not, depending on species, see a little bit of difference if you burn during the mid to latter portion of the growing season. But over time, you certainly can see an impact or influence on plant composition. And so chronic burning during the dormant season or early growing season in early successional areas, including, pine savanna and pine woodlands, that's going to lead to a predominance of grass, with chronic burning at that time. Whereas if you delay your fire into July, August through October, then you're going to have a much better forb component, a much better forb response later on. So I don't prescribe any one strict burning regime for sure, but rather to vary your timing of burning to have as good a plant response with regard to species diversity as possible. But to your point, if you burn during the early portion of the growing season, you're not having a positive effect on reducing woody stems any better than you would during the dormant season, and you are delaying that plant response with regard to that providing brooding cover in another month or so. Whereas if you burned in March or early April, depending on your latitude, prior to spring green up, then you have fantastic cover for broods where it's available in wooded areas, and there's not a delay in the brood cover that's available there.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so you keep talking a lot about the importance of grass coverage and having it kind of an optimal range. What would you say that is for people that are listening that might want to manage these early successional areas for brooding cover?
Well, that's something that we have looked at quite a bit, and except for a grassland obligate songbird, such as a grasshopper sparrow, an eastern meadowlark, Henslow sparrow, etc., I challenge you to name any species in eastern United States that requires, needs, or benefits from more than 30% coverage of grass. Mm-hmm. And that definitely includes northern bobwhite. And so these fields, most of them are so chock full of grass that the lowest hanging fruit on the vine for folks wanting to improve their fields for most wildlife species, and again, exception would be the grassland obligate songbirds, is to reduce the coverage of grass to not more than 30% and have more forb cover and incorporate, of course, both fire, disking, and when needed, herbicide applications to create the not only influence composition, but also to create the best conditions and structure at ground level. And that's when you'll see increased use of these fields by broods and other species.
Really good.
Yeah, and I mean the point that he made earlier that made me think about, you know, the downstream effects of mowing after you destroy the nest, taking away that brood rearing habitat is. I was working with a landowner not too long ago, you know, during the time when, you know, poults were just really starting to, you know, several weeks old, really starting to move around and go to these types of areas. And we were driving around through the property, and a lot of the food plots were getting mowed during that time of the year. And it was something that we had been talking about because there wasn't a lot of other areas that provided opportunity for hens to brood. And we came up, it was like I cued it. We came up to this one food plot, and it looked kind of weedy and overgrown, but I said, you know, this looks better. You know, this is providing some brood rearing cover compared to a lot of the other places on the property, especially the mowed fields. And sure enough, like right on cue, a hen and her brood comes running out of the food plot and crosses the road in front of us. So I couldn't have queued that up any better if I'd tried.
This is, well, it might be somewhat anecdotal. We haven't finished the analysis on all this, but on one of the sites, the hens were regularly nesting in the fields that were available on that property, and they were taking their broods over a mile to areas where they would settle into brooding. And the manager of the property, you know, was, you know, kind of surprised. You know, I can't believe that the broods are leaving and going as far. And I went out and took a look and was walking across the property with them. And, you know, I made the observation, look at the density of the vegetation here. If you were 3-4 inches tall, where could you go? Where could you walk? You literally could not navigate through these fields. It's so thick. And I said, let's step up in the woods. And you go up into the woods and you can see 120 yards. You know, so what's a poult going to do there? Mm-hmm. That would be die. And so the hens were leaving that area. Although the nesting cover was good, the brooding cover was terrible. And so we began working with the landowner to implement various management practices to improve the composition and structure of these fields. And, you know, for example, one of them was just, you know, chock full of big blue stem, Indian grass, and some switchgrass that had been planted. Another one had, you know, a lot of blackberry, you know, across the field, you know, really, really dense. There was another one that had a lot of tall fescue, what I call a tall fescue base across the entire field. And so we simply used various herbicide applications to reduce the density of native grass, and then, of course, burned and used plateau pre-emergence to control some incoming vegetation. We got rid of the tall fescue on another field and used some herbicide and disking to reduce the amount of blackberry in the other site. And, you know, Shazam, the next year, they were noticing broods using those fields. And so, you know, it isn't like revelational or magic. It's just improving the structure and usability of various sites for an animal that's very small and they can't get into and use some sites. And then others that they can, if they don't have adequate overhead cover, they're so much more susceptible to predation. And so one of the things that you know, we're noticing is the use of what you should call actual woodlands. You know, as a definition, that would be a, you know, wooded area, an area of trees that has somewhere between 30 to 80% canopy cover. And so that's a fairly broad range. And it also should have a herbaceous dominated understory in order to meet the definition of a woodland. And so a forest is not synonymous with woodland. There's a huge difference there. And so what we're seeing is the difference or the effect of different amounts of sunlight coming in on the height of the vegetation in the woodland. And so when you treat these woodlands by killing the trees you don't want and leaving the trees you do want to a certain level, and you have in the neighborhood of 30% sunlight coming in, the height of the vegetation, it is so consistent and neat to see, is right about the height of a hen's head, on average. Mm-hmm. And you've got a nice structure underneath because you're using fire. Usually, on average, every 2 years, anywhere from every 1 to 3 years, you're maintaining that site for good brooding cover. And there's excellent cover for broods with regard to overhead cover, but they can move about underneath of it. The hens can see very easy. When you start killing trees or cutting trees such that you get beginning to get about 50% sunlight, then that height, it blows up and it gets to a level to where it's providing more dense cover and it's taller. That structure is very good for nesting, but it can be so dense that it's not optimal for brooding. And so when you go into a woodlot and you treat it, and you don't try to treat it such that you have, most people will say, oh, I want to get 60% or I want to get 60 square feet of basal area per acre. I am not at all interested in basal area. I'm interested in the amount of sunlight coming in. And it's good to have variable amounts. We call that variable retention. And so you go in and kill trees that you don't want, leave ones that you do. Well, there may be areas that I don't like most of these. So I'm going to kill or cut most of them down, or, usually kill them to let them fall apart slowly. And in another area, man, most of these trees are great. And so leave them. And so you have a varying amount of cover, both with regard to density and height in your woods. And you can see the birds responding to that, where they might nest more in these thick areas, but they will go to these, thinner, less tall understory areas for brooding. And they are using these areas really, really well. And it's simply going from unmanaged woods to a woodland that you are reducing canopy cover and using prescribed fire to influence the composition and the structure of the understory, and the birds really respond to it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I would consider that if someone had to press me and say, what would you consider the single best vegetation type for wild turkeys? That's what I would say, an open woodland with variable retention. You've got nesting cover, brooding cover, loafing cover. There's forage in the summer. There's mast in the fall, winter, obviously roost sites. Pretty much everything a turkey needs is in that. And when that is interspersed across the property and the openings are managed as they should be for turkeys, and then on top of that, you implement some amount of trapping to reduce these animals that are eating the eggs and the poults, you're going to see a response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that sounds really similar to the story that Dwayne Elmore just shared in one of our recent previous episodes, where he talked about doing that on his Georgia property.
Yeah, he kind of described a situation where he'd done everything he could think of from a habitat standpoint, and then implemented trapping on, once he got to a point where he didn't know how to improve the habitat any more than he already had. Mm-hmm. He implemented trapping, and that was the same. He told the same story, that he saw that augment the habitat work on his property.
And that is not easy to capture in a study. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Because, the best studies have lots of sites. There's lots of replication. Yep. And getting the landowners or even the state agencies to implement the recommendations that you would like to include in the study design, that is very, very difficult. It's not easy to get all of that habitat management specifically for turkeys done and in a certain amount of intensity that is needed because of all kinds of restraints, whether it's time, financial, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so I will say a lot of that information comes from working with so many property owners that have done that. And, I can't necessarily point you to a journal article on every one of those, but when you implement the correct amount of predator control, I'll say, in with your habitat management work, it will pay dividends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's kind of where
with regard to turkeys, for sure.
Well, we've talked about that quite a bit on the other episodes where we've had a whole segment on trapping, which, when we're giving the perspective from the literature, it's underwhelming because there's so little to base it on, but we've also tried to couch it within this context that there are a lot of landowners that have engaged with really aggressive habitat work and trapping, and they tell that same story. And we've also leaned somewhat on the quail literature, which has some better data to suggest that when you have habitat in order, that you can see dividends from the trapping, and that's kind of where we're at. And we've also talked about all those limitations and difficulties in designing a study like that, and that really is kind of a dream. Sounds like of both Will and I, at least, dream study to do long term.
That is something that hopefully we are about to implement on some of these sites. And something to keep in mind, I got to Tennessee in 1998. TWRA had just stopped the raccoon restoration work in the mid-1990s. In 1998 and 1999, we were still documenting every raccoon that we saw run over on the roads, obviously, and reporting that to show how the raccoon population was responding and expanding. Well, I think it worked. Yeah. Good night, there's coons everywhere. And it's a huge limiting factor. Mm. And skunks and coyotes and in some areas armadillos, for example. But controlling those is very much needed on many properties.
So does that mean that, Craig, that we partially have you to thank for the numbers of coons that are currently in Tennessee?
No, all I was doing was marking down where I saw them as I, tried to steer away from them, hint, on the roads.
So, yeah, you swerve over to hit it and be like, well, there was one.
We don't know why Craig just keeps getting the highest counts of all these roadkill coons.
He's got 12 times the number of anybody else. Half of these reports are from the same person.
Well, that's all good stuff. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Yeah. Is there anything else, any burning questions you don't feel like we've gotten to? Or
well, I think Craig, you're obviously the expert on a lot of this stuff, and have tons of experience working with a lot of people in a lot of places. Are there any strong take-home messages that you'd like to tell people? I guess kind of circling back to this issue with the season frameworks, is there anything that you think is a good take-home for them to think about?
Well, all I can speak to, of course, is what we have done here in Tennessee. I haven't analyzed data from other sites with regard to turkey numbers or harvest and season dates, but we haven't seen an effect of moving the opening day of turkey season back in Tennessee. But that doesn't mean it couldn't have an effect somewhere. I know in Florida, where we had a graduate student working at Tall Timbers and looking at gobbling chronology and nest initiation and thinking of when most nests were the peak nest initiation, we recommended setting the season back in that scenario, anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, according to where the state agency wanted the season opener to fall, whether it was at peak gobbling or at peak nest initiation. So there certainly could be some cases in which that is needed. And I know also on some WMAs, for example, 80% of the gobblers killed on that WMA may be killed on opening weekend. Now, is that a problem? Absolutely. That's got to be a problem. I would like to see more documentation of the effect of moving these season dates. But even on WMAs, where 80% of the birds are killed on opening weekend, does that mean that the season needs to be set back to ameliorate that? I think that's simply bad management. They need to implement on some of those areas, whether it be quota permits or spreading out hunter effort. It doesn't mean you're going to have a negative effect by opening the season at that time. But if you're opening it up to everybody and you have hunting pressure great enough such that you're killing 80% of the birds that are going to be harvested during the opening weekend, certainly that could be a huge problem. And so I think there are multiple things here that obviously should be discussed and addressed, and the answer to all of those may be different. It's not just one single thing that is the answer here. And with regard to the decline in that south middle portion of Tennessee, we have not noticed any effect of disease. Rick Gerhold is leading the disease component of the project. And with all of the hunter-killed birds that we get our hands on, all of any other dead birds that we get our hands on, and blood samples from the birds that we trap, they have looked at all of that and have found no disease, whether it be blackhead or any other problem that may be influencing the turkey numbers or harvest rate down in that area. The smoking gun is primarily the predators, both nest predation and poult survival. They're relatively low, and that's what's driving the relatively low fecundity or addition into the fall population in those areas. And of course, habitat work can be done on all of these areas to help improve conditions such that you may see increased nest or brood survival, and certainly you can influence habitat use by your management.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've pretty well covered a variety of topics, not just the season date, but a whole bunch of other great information. Anything else you
Well,
wanted
there's no way we're not going to also get into habitat when the three of us start talking. So,
well, I mean, most of my thought process has been influenced by Craig on that. So I always want to hear him talk about it.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And Craig, we definitely want to have you back if you're still willing and able to come on and tell us, what we need to know about habitat. We're going to have several episodes on that topic.
Y'all just keep the checks coming in the mail, and I'll show up with this.
Yes.
For the listeners, that is a big joke. Okay.
he may want to wait a few months.
I get nothing from these guys except a hard time. That's for sure.
And that's been for more than a decade now.
Maybe a good time every now and then.
Yeah. Well, I know you've gotten a few laughs from it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, we really appreciate you again taking the time, and it's always really fun to see you and talk to you, and I always learn a ton every time I listen to you. Tell me how things are. So.
Pleasure's mine. I always enjoy visiting with you, and we always have a good time.
Yeah.
He may want to wait a few months to come back on to see if more than 5 people listen to this, and then make a determination from there.
Yeah, all 3 of our listeners really appreciate it too, Craig.
Well, I will say that unfortunately, and I don't know if you want to get into this, but the TWRA commissioners voted this past spring to implement this season delay throughout the state. So the Tennessee statewide season will not begin until mid-April. So I'm thinking early April, now might be a great time to come down to Alabama and sit there in person with you on the podcast, and we can do some other things as well.
That does sound like pretty good time.
I think we can arrange that.
Yep. All right. Well, again, thanks everybody out there for listening. We appreciate all the support, and help us share the podcast, go rate it, do all those things that help us get this word out here. Hopefully, with information like what you provided, Craig, we can have a positive impact on turkeys in general, and that's what this is all about. So we're trying to do our part, and hopefully our listeners will help us as well to extend the word out as far as possible. So thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. We appreciate it.
Very good. Thank y'all.
Wild Turkey Science is sponsored by Turkeys for Tomorrow and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. For more information, follow us on social media linked in the show notes below.